Is this bright enough, or should I hit the lights? Let's see. Can you guys read that in the back? Okay. So I was told by a couple of people that the readings this week were a little more confusing. So I'm going to do my best to deconfuse them. And I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing that the readings were a bit confusing. I suppose it's a mixture. I think that it maybe means that we're kind of getting a little more into, a little more into some of the kind of more complicated stuff. Some of the stuff that requires a little more explanation. So that means that hopefully there'll be more value. There'll be more to explain. So that's even more reason, by the way, to feel free to ask any kind of question you want at any time, confidently armed with the knowledge that many other people might have the same question. And in fact, the stuff we're going to talk about today is yet another example of a seemingly very simple and basic question which just nobody thought to ask, and which, when it was asked, really opened up lots of new and interesting directions. So if you think you have a simple and basic question which is not worth asking, I'm not kidding, it might actually be a source of new and interesting directions. That's happened many, many times in recent years it's happened a few times in recent years in fMRI, and I'm sure it happens in other fields as well. So the basic question that was asked by, in this case by previous quarter, who, as I've mentioned, is a great researcher in this area. He's at Cambridge in UK. He was at NIH when he was doing this work. Very, very simple. It seems like a simple question. It seems like a very basic question, barely even so obvious as to barely be worth thinking about. What is the number that we stick inside each voxel? And the answer was always, ever since the dawn of fMRI, which wasn't that long ago, it was just in the early 90s. Well, the number that you put in each voxel is, well, if it's the raw data, it's just the bold MRI signal. If it's the analysis, it's the activation in each voxel. What else could it possibly be? Well, what Searchlight analysis does is it says, hey, let's put something else in there. And it turns out that opens up all kinds of new directions. And I really think to ask a very kind of basic question like this that seems almost too obvious to be even worth thinking about is a real sign of kind of digging deep and thinking about it. And that's typical of previous quarter. And that's, for instance, what Haxby did when he said, hey, why are we just looking one voxel at a time? Why don't we look at patterns across voxels? Again, it seems like an incredibly, it just seems almost like such a simple question. It doesn't feel sophisticated. I have a personal, this is my own personal belief. My personal belief is that the worst thing that can happen to a scientist is to feel sophisticated. And anytime you learn any kind of new thing, oh no, now I know how to program, now I know how to do this type of statistics, now I know how to use this type of multi-million-dollar machine, now I know how to blah, blah, blah. It feels sophisticated, but what does it mean to be sophisticated? This is just my own personal opinion. What does it mean to be sophisticated? It means that you've kind of, you've baked all the cake and now you're just arranging the icing on it. So, if you're arranging the icing on the cake, you're not thinking anymore about, why we're eating cake in the first place. Right? So a very more basic question is not, in many cases, going to seem like a sophisticated question. It's going to almost seem like a stupidly simple question. But it might be a brilliantly, insightfully simple question. And I think that's what Haxby did when he said, hey, let's look at patterns instead of one voxel at a time. That's what previous quarter did when he said, why is this number that we're sticking inside a voxel just the activation value. So one thing we've talked about quite a bit is that the activation value may not necessarily be what we care about. What we really care about is what is the brain doing? How is the brain processing information? How is the brain representing the world? How is the brain solving this problem of dealing with this big, noisy, complicated stuff out there so that we can survive and prosper? And that may or may not be related to whether a particular voxel becomes more or less active. So you really want to get something that's trying to get a bit more information instead of just at activation. So can anyone think of a kind of broad case example, not like a particular task or something, but what's the kind of scenario, or a kind of scenario in which just looking at activation, whether activation gets more or less intense, may not necessarily tell you what you care about.
Like the time series might be more important.
That's a very good point. So it might be that an activation value is just a single moment in time, or the average over some period of time. There was this much stuff. It's like one snapshot. But it might be that how things are changing over time are important. If you're looking at say, how steady is somebody, you're looking at, say, a patient who has a problem walking, and you're saying how steady is their gait, right? You care about some kind of rhythmic thing that's happening. You don't care very much about, what's the weight of their foot on the floor. You might care about what's the relative weight of both their feet on the floor, but you care about something that's unfolding over time. And that happens a lot. That's a very good example. How about even if something is just at a single moment in time, that the activation intensity might not necessarily be, like the average local activation intensity might not necessarily be telling you what you're interested in. I'll give you a clue. Remember the example of counting how much ink there is in, say, in the letter M versus the letter W, something like that.
Maybe you're more worried about a pattern.
Exactly. So there's many cases in which it's really, well, this was a hypothesis at the time, and its subsequent work has shown that this actually really is the case. But the hypothesis was, hey, maybe sometimes, just how much activation stuff there is, how much something is going up or down isn't actually what matters. Maybe there's actually important information to be gleaned from what the patterns are. So just as like a kind of, ink counting device will tell the difference between the letter M and the letter I, it won't tell the difference between the letter M and the letter W. Just as if I have something in my brain that detects the amount of faciness that's present, faciness, activation intensity, then every single one of you, I look at it and I get lots of activation intensity of faciness, just as much for any of you, right? Unless one of you is, wearing sunglasses or a mask or something like that, right? But you're not all just, like n units of faciness. You're different faces, right? You have different patterns. That's how you're distinct as individuals. So this kind of thing happens a lot in the world, and maybe it happens in our brain too. Certainly the brain is sensitive to different patterns in the world. Well, now there's no particular reason why the brain is obliged to represent different patterns in the world with different spatial patterns of intensity. It could, if the brain felt like it, it could represent everything as different patterns over time, as Adam pointed out. And in fact, there's actually evidence, this is kind of a whole area in itself, there's evidence that some things probably are represented as different patterns in time, especially of things that themselves vary over time, such as, for instance, a speech signal, right? That's something that unfolds over time. But even maybe of things that don't vary over time, and there's lots of people working on that. That's more of something that people don't necessarily look at so much with fMRI, because fMRI is not as sensitive in the time dimension. this is a kind of backtracking question, but can anyone say just briefly why is fMRI less sensitive in the time dimension than, say, recording from individual neurons or something like that? Yeah, Albert.
Because of the hemodynamic response.
Exactly, because what we're measuring is this indirect measure of this. The stuff we really care about is the neurons, which are very, very fast. What we're actually measuring is the blood oxygenation response, which is much more slow and sluggish. If what you're fundamentally measuring is slow and sluggish, that kind of limits you. Now, it may not limit you to only measuring things that happen once every 18 seconds, which is what people first thought, but it limits you to some degree. So here's a basic question: what is the number inside each voxel? So Cruz suggested in 2006 that instead of the number that you stick in each voxel being an activation intensity, instead say how much information is present. Okay, now there's different ways of measuring information, but in this case it means pattern information. So and there's different ways of measuring pattern information too. But so here's the basic idea. Why is this thing called the Searchlight? So in a standard fMRI analysis, and by standard I mean the kind of stuff that we were looking at in those kind of MATLAB exercises from a few weeks ago, where we were saying, to what degree does a particular voxel go up when this stimulus was present, and you kind of see, well, if that stimulus triggered a hemodynamic response, then we would predict this kind of voxel time course, and the degree to which voxel actually does show that time course, that's the degree to which it lit up. So in a standard analysis, it's called general linear model analysis, basically it's a regression. You say, okay, how much did this voxel light up? How much did this voxel light up? How much did this voxel light up? And you do that, 20,000 times, or however many voxels you have. So that's what they call it, a massively univariate analysis. So that is kind of a searchlight, except that the searchlight is one voxel. So you're saying, tell me what's going on here, tell me what's going on here, tell me what's going on here. And you can imagine, it's kind of as if you're sweeping this kind of searchlight of, tell me how much activation there is through the whole brain. Okay? So now, suppose instead of just saying, tell me this voxel, this voxel, this voxel, you say, give me this local neighborhood of voxels, give me this local neighborhood of voxels, this local neighborhood of voxels. And as you can imagine, as you kind of slowly shift the local neighborhood, they're going to overlap with each other a bit. You're literally just kind of grabbing a local sphere of voxels each time. And you say, and then when you do that, instead of getting a voxel, which you can say, well, does it go up, does it go down? Now you've grabbed a set of voxels, okay? And that set of voxels has a pattern. So here's a kind of picture of what a radius 3 sphere would look like. Because it's voxels, it's all kind of chunky and pixelated. So it kind of looks a bit like a Rubik's Cube with little knobs on the side. But so that's so you can say, well, how big a local neighborhood do I want? And this is actually an open. This is kind of your own choice. Depends what kind of thing you're interested in. But a typical thing to do is pick, say, a radius 3, or you might pick a bigger one, and then you'll have 33 or 120 something voxels, and each time you get a different pattern out. So so here's how that might kind of look. So you've got some brain image. I mean, this is just a slice, but obviously the actual thing would be a 3D image. Take this little kind of pixelated, voxelated sphere, move it around. Each time it's centered in a different place. So right now it's centered here, and we're going to get this little neighborhood of 33 voxels around here. And then each time you get a pattern across those voxels, and then you can say, well, I've got one pattern for condition A, one pattern for condition B. What's the pattern difference between those patterns? Now then, there's different ways of deciding what the pattern difference is. One thing that we looked at in the last class was the simple way is look at what's the correlation between those patterns. That's actually a pretty decent measure. You could also look at, for instance, what's the kind of average squared activation intensity difference between these patterns. There's different measures you could take. But in whatever choice you make, and this again depends on what kind of question you're asking, the end result is that you're getting a measure of pattern difference, not just a measure of activation difference. And so then, for that measure of pattern difference, that's the number, instead of the number being the activation, that's the number that you end up writing in like that central voxel there. So then you get a brain full of numbers, just like you do from any fMRI analysis, but this time they're information values and they're not activation values. Now, so this is called information-based fMRI. It's often when people talk about multi-voxel pattern analysis, this is actually what they're doing. It's a very popular method. Information is actually a kind of slightly slippery term. Does anyone know like two different senses of the term information? There's a kind of technical sense and there's a kind of our everyday sense. Has anyone heard of like the technical sense of information? Yeah.
Well, I know two different technical senses.
Mhm.
Kolmogorov information and Shannon information.
Oh man, okay, you're giving like a high. Okay, let's just stick with the Shannon information.
Okay.
What approximately is? I mean, I'm not asking you for a proper definition here, but what more or less approximately is Shannon information?
It's the amount of information gained is proportional to the amount of uncertainty that's being eliminated.
Okay,
Yes,
right,
is it?
exactly. So this is just a little, okay, I'm just going to talk for like a couple of minutes about information. There's some terms that you're going to encounter in cognitive neuroscience, or in fact just in science in general, which have a kind of everyday use and they have a kind of intuitive use and they have a more technical use. And these two uses may or may not actually go hand in hand, and this can cause lots and lots of confusion. So one example that we looked at before was like linear versus nonlinear. So often nonlinear just kind of gets used to mean kind of complicated, but especially in scientific terms and in imaging terms as well, linear has a very specific meaning that means you put twice as much in, you get twice as much out. You put A and B in, you get F and A and F and B out. So now information is another thing which also kind of has its like technical use and its non-technical use. So here and this is a little bit tricky because in information-based imaging it doesn't necessarily mean the actual kind of technical Shannon sense. So just to this is not really crucial to understanding information-based imaging, but it's probably just worth saying anyway. So back in the day, people were trying to put signal down telephone lines. And it turned out that Bell Labs got together many of the greatest scientists of the age and had this amazing, amazing research center in New Jersey for people figuring out, in essence, how can you stick, as much signal as you can down a telephone line. And this guy called Claude Shannon laid the foundations for an astounding amount of subsequent work by inventing what he called information theory, which originally was designed to figure out, how this stuff could you stick down a telephone line. And so what's called Shannon information is this very specific thing of basically, it's defined in terms of probabilities and uncertainties, like Tommy mentioned, but you can think of it in terms of how much can you compress stuff. Okay? So they were interested in trying to kind of squeeze as much signal as they could down a line, so they wanted to see kind of to what degree could you compress it without kind of destroying it. And so if something has lots of Shannon information in it, then you can't compress it very much. That's a very hand-wavy definition, but that's more or less what it boils down to. But the problem is that this actually does not match up at all, or at least in many instances, it doesn't match up at all with what our kind of intuitive thought of information is. So if I say, how do I find the post office? And you say, well, you go down there and you take a left and drive a bit and there's the post office. You've given me some information. Okay? But this isn't necessarily the same thing. So here's an example of where information in the sense that we kind of care about more, in the sense, the kind of meaningful information sense, and this kind of more technical sense of information can come completely apart. So suppose I took, say, the entire contents of Wikipedia, and I said, look, here it is. It's on, a thumb drive or something, or maybe you need to fit in more than that these days. Here's lots and lots of information. If the world got blown up and you had to reconstruct civilization, you'd be doing reasonably well if someone gave you that. Okay? Now suppose I took that entire big text file and I replaced every single letter in it with a random letter. Right? From a Shannon point of view, I've actually increased the amount of information in that file. Okay? So from the point of view of like how much useful, kind of meaningful stuff is there in there, I've totally wiped it. Right? But if I were to say how much can I compress this, what's on that thumb drive, if it's actually like real English words, you can compress it a lot because lots of the words happen loads and loads of times, like the. You don't have to represent the by 3 letters. You could just represent it by 1 letter or something. You could totally shrink that thing down. In fact, that's if you ever zip a file, which you probably all do quite often. That's exactly what it's doing. If I were to replace every single one of those letters by a random letter, I wouldn't be able to compress that thing at all. Okay? So I've now made more information in that file. So that's just kind of one illustration of the fact that you have to be a little bit careful when you're talking about information. So that's all just a kind of long roundabout way of saying that this is actually really means information in the sense of preferably meaningful information, not necessarily this thing that sounds like it's much more, must be more scientific because you can define it with, an equation with logs and probabilities in it. Okay? So this is really trying to figure out, how is the brain finding information that it actually cares about? And a pretty good measure of whether the brain cares about something is whether it's reflected in our behavior. Although that may not be the only measure. But anyway, that's just a clarification that I wanted to put out there because when you first, how many of you, just out of interest, how many of you have already encountered this concept of like Shannon information? Okay, so when you first encounter it, you'll think like, wow, this is, before I just had this kind of fuzzy, vague idea of what information was, but now I know what information is. It's this thing that's, like a kind of an equation. It's the sum of p log, negative p log p or whatever. Okay, that doesn't necessarily correspond to what you actually really care about. That's another illustration of just because something looks more sophisticated doesn't mean it's necessarily what you want. Now, by the way, this is not in any way to like diminish information theory, which is unbelievably hugely important area. I'm just saying that things may or may not be. What we're trying to think about here is, what's stuff that matters to the brain, what's stuff that means something. And it's much harder. Saying that something means something, is meaningful to an organism, is important to it, is not necessarily the same thing as saying, it's got n bits of information in it. Like as that kind of, replace Wikipedia with random letters example hopefully shows. Okay, so the end result is you get a map, and but instead of having activation values in it, you get information values, which are typically pattern differences. So this has some advantages and some disadvantages. And by the way, this is a very popular method now. So probably the biggest advantage, and this is something we've talked about a bit before. In fact, we talked about it just a few minutes ago, is that there's just some kinds of things which you're not going to see if you're just looking at activation differences. You're not, if you just count the amount of ink that's present in a letter, you ain't going to tell the difference between M and W. If you look at just the activation intensity, there's certain kinds of differences that you're just not going to see. Whereas if you look at pattern differences, you are going to see them. One nice set of examples are in the Haxby paper that we looked at. We started to explore the Haxby data a little bit too. So, for instance, in some cases you really get clear activation differences. So if you want to see the difference between a face and a house, there really are some brain areas which are more active for faces than they are for houses, and there's really some brain areas which are more active for houses than they are for faces. That doesn't mean that that's the only thing they care about, and in fact that's not the only thing they care about, although people are still arguing about that. But in this case, just activation intensity is really showing you a difference. But some of the other stimuli in there, for instance, like the difference between shoes and bottles and scissors and chairs. Right? There's no area which is more active for scissors than it is for bottles. You know, and well, why should there be such an area, right? I mean, faces at least are things that are kind of evolutionarily more important to us, and maybe houses too, or at least, you know, scenes. But there are pattern differences, and you can, and these are pattern differences that you can actually find and, you know, pull out when they classify. So that's probably the single biggest advantage. This is one of the main reasons why this is a popular approach. Is not just why searchlight analysis is a popular approach, but why any kind of pattern analysis is a popular approach, because there's just some kind of differences that you're just not going to see just by looking at activation intensity. So that's what people, when people refer to GLM analysis, that's what they're talking about. But there's also disadvantages too. So one thing that we've also been kind of talking about in the class is that just knowing where in the head something happens is not really a useful end result. I mean, it depends what question you're asking, but in many cases what we really care about is not, you know, is it happening here, is it happening here? What we care about is what's the process that's happening in the brain. How is the brain representing information? How is the brain processing information? How is the brain solving this incredibly difficult computational problem of dealing with the world? You know, knowing that that happens in the front right-hand part of your head or the back of your head or wherever is a step, but it certainly doesn't answer any of those questions. So in one way, the fact that, you know, searchlight analysis produces maps as outputs is nice, because if, you know, we're used to dealing with maps and imaging. But in another sense, it's actually kind of a problem, because ultimately a map is not really what you care about. It might not be what you care about. So you know, just because you end up with some image that, you know, shows you like locations instead of locations of activation, it shows you locations of information in this case, it's still not showing you representations, which is what you really want. So there's another question that you can go on to look at beyond that, which is not just is some information present. Typically the result of a searchlight analysis is to say some pattern information is present, you know, in some particular location of the brain. But then if you want to go a little bit beyond that and say, not just is there information there, but how is that information represented? What is the structure of the representation of that information? You know, we'll look in a little minute what you might mean by structure. And then you can take another approach, which in fact you can actually combine these approaches as well, which is to look at the set of similarities. So this is often called representational similarity analysis. And the person who came up with this was also Krüger-Scott. Okay, so he's kind of an impressive fellow. So what do I mean when I say representations have structure? Okay, so here's a few examples. This is pulled out from a paper from Tom Griffith, who's a kind of Bayesian modeling person at Berkeley. So there's lots and lots of different types of structure in the world. So here's some types of structure. What's this one? This is one from language. Okay, so if you take a sentence, then it has different parts in it. I don't know, this is probably too small to see at the back, but this says, you know, I fulfill a function. It could just as well say, the cat sat on the map. Okay, so you know, you've got some parts that are nouns, some that are verbs, some relation between the noun phrase and the verb phrase. You can kind of decompose a sentence into this kind of tree-like hierarchical structure. So there's structure in there. Okay, it's not just a string of words. It's a string of words which is kind of built out of some kind of structure. If you take a visual scene, you probably can't see this either, but this is a picture of a room with a table and a window and stuff like that. Okay, there's structure there too. There's different objects, there's a foreground, there's a background, there's a relation. You know, if I look out at this room here, okay, one of the reasons why vision is a very difficult problem is because, you know, I'm just getting these little kind of 2D patches of light on my retina, but somehow my brain figures out, okay, well there's this thing right here, right at the front, there's this object, which if I'm going to try and walk through it, you know, I better move around. There's a bunch of people here. People are like a certain type of entity which I need to interact with in a certain way. there's a lot of the people I can only kind of half see because they're mostly hidden behind other people, but I don't think this is half a person, I think there's a whole person there. So there's all kinds of structure in this room that, I'm somehow pulling out from these little colored patches hitting the backs of my eyes, and somehow my brain is representing not just that there's kind of, colored moving stuff out there, but that there's something's closer, something's further, there's a whole structured world. So one of the things that you can look at if you start to look at the relations between different neural representations is you can start to say, well, what kind of structure is there? And a simple type of, or at least a good place to start in terms of looking at structure is looking at similarity structure. So here's a figure from a paper by Josh Tannenbaum. There's another kind of Bayesian modeling person at MIT. It says, suppose you show people lots of different types of kind of, these biomorphic shell plant-like looking things. Can you see these at all at the back there? Okay. So if you just show people a bunch of these things, they don't just look at them and say, oh yeah, there's a bunch of stuff. They automatically, just our brains are somehow kind of set up to do this, we automatically start perceiving them as more or less similar to each other. And so, certain relations, so what this kind of tree diagram represents is, how similar are different things perceived as being to each other. So if things are on the same branch of the tree, they're more similar, and if they're on different branches of the tree, they're less similar, and then you've got kind of branches and sub-branches. So just in the way people kind of automatically carve up the world, this is the way our brain kind of see things. Some of these shapes, there's these ones over here that sort of look like, nautilus-like seashell-y type things. There's these ones over here that kind of look a little bit like, I don't know, some kind of plant or tree branch or something. There's these ones over here that look a little bit more like shrubs, or there's some kind of jellyfish-looking things over here. So there's a kind of similarity structure of shapes, a similarity structure of basically almost anything that our brain represents, that somehow in our heads, and if you try and look at the similarity relations between different neural activation patterns, then if you're lucky, you might be able to pull out some of that structure. So,
Raj, I have a quick
yes.
And it's not only that these are structured, so they're clustered together because they're visually similar, or is it the case in this that they are, or is it, is it something more abstract, like they're also, on a sort of encyclopedic knowledge of these things? These are located in the ocean, and these are located, so is it abstract in that, sort of
very, very good point.
Conceptually related? Or?
That's an extremely good point. Okay, I'm going to skip forward. Thank you for an excellent question. Here's a perfect example of what, a very kind of basic level question which really gets straight to the heart of the matter. So, okay, so one of the crucial problems with similarity is that you have to ask similarity in which sense. So here's a question. This sounds like a silly question. Is a gun similar to a banana? Right? Well, the answer is it depends. Right? If you're saying, so just as Frank said, is this visual similarity or is it similarity more in terms of, he was saying, are these things from the ocean? That would be a kind of, biological similarity, if you like, or in this case, you could say a functional similarity, right? If your question is, does a gun look like a banana, especially in terms of kind of broad outline, then the answer is yes, right? Especially if your gun is painted yellow, right? But if you say, do they have functional similarity? No, right? If your question is, can I eat this thing, right? Definitely, they're very different. So people have interpreted this in different ways. So one school of thought says, this means that the whole idea of similarity is just poorly defined, and we should just kind of junk it. But in general, what people are saying now is, well, no, you just have to say, in order to well define it, you can't just say similarity, period. You have to say similarity in what sense. So I can't really, if I just say, is a gun similar to a banana? Yeah, sure, that's not a very well defined question. But if I say, is a gun visually similar to banana? Now it has a well-defined answer. If I say, is it functionally similar to a banana? It has a well-defined answer. And this is actually not an uncommon thing at all. You know, similarity is a relational concept, right? It's looking at the relation between this thing and this thing. And actually, lots of relational concepts are like this, that you have to specify not just, you know, does this relation hold, but does this relation hold in a particular sense? So one example is, you know, is something to the left of something, right? So, you know, am I standing to the left of this lectern here? Right? Well, from my point of view, yes. From your point of view, no. So, does this mean that the very concept to the left of is a meaningless concept? No, it just means that you have to specify a particular sense. Okay, now that was actually skipping forward a little bit. Okay, I'll get back to the other slides in just a second. There's another sense in which similarity is actually a little bit more of a complicated notion than you might think. So here's a question. So, if I take two objects and I say, so I've got, this cup of drink here and this cup of water and this remote control, right? And I say, the distance of this remote control to this cup is 30 centimeters. Okay? And then I say, oh, well, that's the distance from the remote control to the cup. What about the distance from the cup to the remote control? Well, it's obviously the same, right? Distance is the jargon term is a symmetric relationship. Okay? And you might say that similarity is also obviously a symmetric relationship, right? Like if an apple is similar to a pear, then a pear is similar to an apple. Okay? So here's an example. Here's an example which may or may not fit that pattern. Okay, sure. So how similar is Luxembourg to France? Would you say it's very similar, quite similar? Let's do one of these humming type things. Okay. So if you think, well, no, this is on a scale, so it's kind of hard. Oh no, you could do it on loudly. Okay. Hum. The more similar you think Luxembourg is to France, the louder you should hum. Okay. So is Luxembourg similar to France? Yeah. Okay. So Luxembourg is kind of quite similar to France, right? Okay. How similar is France to Luxembourg? Right? Somehow, now this is kind of weird, right? Somehow France feels less similar to Luxembourg than Luxembourg feels to France. Okay, now why might that be? By the way, does anyone share this intuition, or are you thinking like, no, they feel like completely the same to me? Does anyone get this? In general, I didn't make this up. People have done these kind of studies. So the reason why people feel that Luxembourg, well, this is a theory. The theory is that the reason why people feel that Luxembourg is more similar to France than France is to Luxembourg is because, think of it in terms of like a kind of set relationship. Okay, so you've got the set of all properties that France has, okay, and the set of all properties that Luxembourg has. And you can basically think, how many of you actually been to Luxembourg and France? Probably quite a lot of you have been to France. Who's been to Luxembourg? Okay. Luxembourg is kind of like, just like a very small and kind of more boring version of France, okay? So every single property that France has, every single property that Luxembourg has is basically a subset of what France has, okay? But there's tons of stuff that France has that Luxembourg doesn't have, right? France has Paris, right? France has the French Riviera. France has, the winemaking regions of Bordeaux, okay? France has, all kinds of stuff, okay? So France had Napoleon, right? So if you look at this kind of subset relationship, it's like Luxembourg is like the properties of Luxembourg are like a little subset of the properties of France. So if you think of similarity as what's the degree of overlap, what's the degree of kind of set overlap of these properties, Luxembourg is just like France because everything in Luxembourg is in France, but France is not so much like Luxembourg because there's lots of stuff that's in our mental image of France that's not at all in our mental image of Luxembourg, like it has Paris, for instance. Okay. And it turns out that there's actually a big debate in the history of cognitive psychology about precisely this question. So a lot of you have probably heard of Amos Tversky. How many of you heard of like Kahneman and Tversky? Okay, so there's these people who did a lot of work on judgment under uncertainty, and Daniel Kahneman actually won the Nobel Prize for Economics for this. His work gave rise to the entire area of behavioral economics. It was an important factor. And Tversky totally would have gotten the Nobel Prize too, but unfortunately he died, and you can't get the Nobel Prize posthumously. So, but amazingly, as well as having done all that stuff, Tversky is actually also very famous for having come up with this kind of alternative theory of similarity. So the main guy in the history of kind of cognitive psychology of similarity, he's actually still alive, but he's very, very old right now. I think he's like 90 or something. Is Roger Shepard, who was at Stanford. They were both at Stanford, actually. And basically says similarity can be represented by positions in a space. And similarity is like a distance measure. So that's, in that case, the similarity of two things to each other really is just like the distance of the remote control to the water, or the water to the remote control. And in that case, it really is a symmetric relationship. And in fact, there's a whole bunch of things that you can do with a space if you treat things in this way. In particular, and we're going to look at an example of this in a minute, you can try and kind of find a lower dimensional representation of that space. I mean, you can actually do some of that in the set theory way as well, but and that was basically kind of thought of as like the notion of similarity for quite a long time. And then in 1977, Tversky came along and said, well, what about this kind of example, like Luxembourg frames? At the time, actually, one of the examples he used was China and North Korea, but China and North Korea are a lot more different now than they were back in the 70s, so that example doesn't work quite as well anymore. So if you get really into kind of looking at the psychology of similarity, this will be something that you will encounter. And this is actually relevant for this question of, well, what do we mean by neural similarity? Do we mean this thing that's like a kind of distance measure, like in a Shepard sense, or do we mean this thing that's more like a set overlap measure in the Tversky sense? For neural similarity, people typically use more this Shepard type measure because it's not really kind of clear what the set overlap measure would be. If I've got a neural activation vector, it's not, it's just a bunch of numbers. It's not something which has a set of features, like it has Paris in it. It produces wine. Napoleon used to rule it. Okay? So, which doesn't mean that this is not actually a useful measure for neural activation. It just means it's not very easy to figure out how to use it. It's entirely likely that somebody will come up with a very interesting way of, maybe one of you people will come up with a very interesting way of actually using a Tversky type measure on neural activation, but it's not generally used that much at the moment. But in terms of the question of how is this represented psychologically is kind of an important question. Okay, now I think I just skipped forward a bit. Okay, so why would you want to care about similarity? So I already talked about that a little bit. So these were the slides I skipped over when Frank raised that very interesting point. So one of the really crucial things that Roger Shepard suggested is that similarity underlies generalization. We talked about this a little bit in some earlier sessions where I showed, say, like a bunch of different pictures of John Stewart. Okay, and you could all immediately see, yeah, this is John Stewart. There's some sense in which these people are all the same, but if you were to actually try and ask, well, if I show you 5 pictures of John Stewart, how do you know that a 6th person is also John Stewart? That's actually kind of a difficult question. Okay, so that's generalization. That's going from a number of instances of a particular class to new instances of a particular class. And so what Shepard suggested was that the way we do this is by using some kind of similarity measure. So you say, you encounter something new, and you say, okay, well, this is new. What am I going to do with it? And the first question you do is you say, well, to what degree is it similar to something that I already know? And if it's really, really similar to something that I already know, then I'm going to treat it really, really much in the same way as that thing I already know. If it's a little bit less similar to the thing that I know, then I'm going to treat it in not quite as much the same way. So you can represent something in terms of its similarity. So he would call this kind of like, you know, how similar does a new item have to be to stuff you already know for the stuff you already know to have any relevance to it whatsoever? So he would call this the consequential region. This is basically, the kind of, you could think of it as the kind of fringe around things you already know, which if anything falls into that fringe, then it has consequences for those things. But another reason for thinking that it's actually might be important is that similarity can actually be an efficient way of representing the world. So here's an example of that, and this is from a very interesting paper. This is actually a colleague of mine at Cornell, but I'm fortunate I have a grant with at the moment. We're doing some collaboration. So he has a really nice paper, which I highly recommend, called Representation is a Representation of Similarities, which I think is a great title because the title really kind of captures the key idea. And Shimon is very interested in this question of how visual objects are represented. So, well, actually, I'm going to skip to a non-visual object example first. Okay. So suppose I ask you. Here's an example of why representing things in terms of similarities can be efficient. So suppose I ask you, what is a grapefruit? Well, you could represent a grapefruit in terms of all of its kind of low-level features, right? So, or kind of mid-level features, right? So here's a description of a fruit. Okay, so it's a large fruit, the citrus family, and it's got internal segments sort of arranged a bit like longitude regions in the Earth, and it grows in warm climates, and blah 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 blah. Okay, so you could go on for a long time describing in terms of its kind of physical, perceptual attributes what a grapefruit is, right? But you could also describe it more in terms of with reference to its similarity of things that you already know. So you're kind of exploiting existing knowledge to get a more compact representation. So instead of describing it in terms of lower level features, you describe it more in terms of things at a similar kind of level. So you could say, yeah, it's kind of like a big orange, but it's yellow and it's more sour. Right? So this description is a very nice and compact way of telling you what a grapefruit is if you already know what an orange is. If you don't already know what an orange is, this description is no use to you whatsoever. Okay. So here's an example of a kind of computational kind of efficiency that you can get by exploiting some existing information. If you represent things in terms of their similarities to things that you already